But before I begin and introduce our speaker, I did want to mention very quickly that as questions emerge to you, as I'm sure they will, as Professor Lucia speaks, please just pop them in the chat, and we'll deal with them towards the end of our conversation. And so let me go ahead and say one thing about an event we're having in the near future, which is our sort of signature event every year, which is called the Solanki Lecture. And this year, we will have Ananda Giriharidas as our speaker, and she'll be in conversation with the president of Cal State Long Beach, Jane Conley. And so it should be a really fun and interesting conversation. I hope all of you can join us. If you're not on our lists, please just email us at indiastudies@Cal State Long Beach, excuse me, at csulb.edu. And we'll put you on the list, and we'll send you out the invitation and some reminders. So let's hit the road. Our speaker today is Amanda Lucia, associate professor of religious studies at University of California-Riverside. She received her PhD at the University of Chicago, studied with Wendy Doniger, and works on the global circulation of Hinduism and how it touches ground all over the world, especially here in the US. And as I was just telling Professor Lucia earlier, that this is a kind of, what she's been working on for a long time is something that we as a center have become especially interested of late, which is the sort of how India travels, and especially the story and the saga of the Indian diaspora. So I'm, very excited to have her speak with us. She is the author of 2 books. The latest is White Utopias, Religious Exoticism of Transformational Festivals. And her previous work is Reflections of Amma, Devotees in a Global Embrace. And she's written lots and lots and lots of other things. So please, be aware of that. And she's also working on a great new project from what little I read about. It seems super interesting on gurus and scandal and representation. So maybe if anyone has a question about that, we can talk about it later. So thank you. And please, Professor Lucia, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure that you have other things to do besides be in a Zoom room at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday, but I very much am grateful that you're here. And I hope to entertain and also educate and, have a great conversation with y'all afterwards. So welcome. I want to thank the hosts for inviting me, for Kim Walters and Mihir Pandya and of course the Yadunandan Center for India Studies. I'm quite jealous that you have a Center of India Studies at CSU Long Beach, which is something we aspire to at UCR. I'm local, so we can always talk in future. And I'm going to share some slides before I really get started. All right. So I want to preface this talk with 2 points of recognition. One, I want to acknowledge, I live in Pomona, so I'm here on Tongva lands, and I want to acknowledge the current and previous stewards of this land and express my gratitude to be able to be here and live here and feed my children here on the unceded land of the Tongva people. I also want to note a little bit about academic publishing. So I'm sure there's a lot of academics in the audience that know that this book it came out in October, right? So that means that it was in proofs by June. So if you all were recalling what was happening here in LA in June, it was nothing good. At least out here in the Inland Empire, there were protests for Black Lives Matter on one corner and protests for Blue Lives Matter on the other corner, because we live in that kind of space. George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police on May 25th, and then the summer had a number of other police incidents. I shouldn't even say police incidents, murders by police. And I think that it's really important what I was able to do. First of all, the publisher wouldn't let me do much because this book was created between 2011 and 2019, really was the bulk of the field research. And in some ways it's good that there's important absence to note that Black Lives Matter was not really a character in these fields for those 8 years. Now, it did make me feel concerned a bit because what I saw this past summer was a lot of my informants interacting and acting in respect to Black Lives Matter in multifarious ways. So there were some people doing what I would say performative politics, you know, Blackout Tuesday and those kind of things that happened this past summer, if you recall. There were other people who were marching in the streets and very much were active in the civil unrest or the protests that were happening. There were other people, for example, Yoga Alliance put up a post in support of Black Lives Matter, to which about 400 people then got into an argument about whether that was anti-yogic. And in fact, all lives matter was a more yogic thing to say. So that's one angle. The other thing that I noticed looking back at this book was, if you have it, you can look at page 193. There is a person who's giving a speech at Lightning in a Bottle, and she's talking about the lizard people. And at the end, she says, do your research, which is fascinating because one of the things that we've seen over the summer and into the fall is the confluence of what some people are calling conspirituality. So conspiracy theory, QAnon, and yoga kind of blending in with anti-vaxxing and libertarian politics. So that's very much active and live. And I think it was interesting that that speech that the woman gave at Lightning in a Bottle was in 2016. And she gave it at that same event. David Avocado Wolf, who's famous for the Flat Earth Society, also spoke at that event. So even while, you know, everyone was kind of surprised, and I was surprised to see yoga kind of take this strong right turn in the last 6 months, it's interesting to note that it was also there 5 years ago, if only you had the kind of forethought to see it. Aside from that, I'll start at the beginning and tell you what I thought I was doing and how I ended up writing this project, and maybe some things that we can glean from it. So I moved here in 2011 from Chicago, and I was randomly at my daughter's preschool, in fact, and picked up a flyer for Bhakti Fest. And I had no real connections to Southern California before I came, and I thought, hey, Bhakti means devotion in Hindi, and so maybe it'll be the Indian Hindu community. I didn't really do any research on it. I just kind of drove out to Joshua Tree to think I would meet local Hindus and learn something. And when I got there, it's a festival of yoga and kirtan. Kirtan is devotional music. And it's, at that time, I think was about 3 to 5 days. And I expected to see, as I said, the Indian Hindu community, but when I got there, I was really surprised to see that it was almost completely a white festival. From that recognition, it struck me, but I didn't think too much of it, which also says something about how I've changed from then until now as well. But I kept going back because I was intrigued. I also had a few interesting interactions over the course of that weekend where I was coming from Chicago in a space looking at Hindu converts or New Age religiosity, spirituality, where most people I had met would have recently, you know, within the last 10 to 20 years, become interested in Indic or South Asian spirituality. Whereas when I was talking to people at Bhakti Fest, I remember I asked one gentleman, so when did you get into Self-Realization Fellowship and Yogananda? And he said, oh, my grandmother was on the board of directors in 1940. Or when I asked someone named Kali what made her pick up that name or adopt that name, she said, oh, it's the name my parents gave me, right? So people who are born into this world, as well as people who maybe third generation Hare Krishnas or the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. So very deep roots to what we might say a spiritual or a new age or a Western Bhakti tradition. So from Bhakti Fest, I decided that this was going to be fodder enough for thinking that this would be a project. So I went on to Shakti Fest, which is its sister festival. And this is a bit of a list of all of the different festivals that I ended up at. So I followed the yoga teachers for the most part, because I found also in these festival spaces, yoga teachers were not just teaching postural yoga. In fact, they were almost sermonizing throughout their yoga classes. And, you know, in studios, oftentimes there's restrictions that the studio owner may say, please don't use any Sanskrit to their yoga teachers, or please don't espouse philosophy, right? To try to keep it more kind of mainstream to be marketable. Whereas here at the festivals, yoga teachers were really espousing their own philosophies as an opportunity for gaining followers and developing their brands and making sure that people heard about their particular take on spiritual ideas. So I used yoga as a means of entry. After Shakti Fest, then went to Wanderlust. And Wanderlust was very much a kind of, I should say, a global, more secular yoga festival, some of the most difficult yoga of any of the festivals that I did. And then went to more kind of transformational festivals, or what you might see as music festivals, maybe even a bit more mainstream, more drug-induced, more party, of Lightning in a Bottle, which is kind of the stepsister to the kind of grandfather of all festivals, which is Burning Man. And I felt like I had to go to Burning Man just because it had kind of been so substantive and creating transformational cultural worlds. I still, or in 2019, well, before the pandemic hit, I was still running a bakery at Burning Man, and that's a position that I kind of still hold. Should Burning Man 2021 happen, I think I'll probably do it again. So I'll disclose that as well. Throughout all this work, I began to see festivals as a kind of under-recognized institution for the spiritual but not religious. So there were very much educational events where there were workshops going on throughout each day. There were yoga classes, oftentimes on multiple stages and multiple locations throughout the festival. There were meditation centers throughout the festivals, but then also workshops on indigenous knowledge, ayahuasca, conscious capitalism, all different Tibetan singing bowls, crystal skull healing, on and on and on. I found that people were learning and also transmitting knowledge. Oftentimes people carried notebooks with them and just kind of like mini classes where they connected with people, and of course phones as well. Here's approximately where yoga fit in on each of these festivals. So I'm going to kind of go through these charts rather quickly without spending too much time. But you can see this is Shakti Fest. I went through the booklet that was given at each festival and just made a tally of different workshops and what was offered. So you can see yoga comes in at number 1, then kirtan, after that breathwork, then bhakti, divine feminine and masculine workshops, astrology, dance, hooping is hula hooping, therapeutic kind of psychological workshops, and then tantra or neo-tantra. Bhakti Fest, again, yoga comes in at number 1. And you can see the size of the festival is almost double to Shakti Fest. So 70 some odd yoga classes versus 30. And of course, that's 2013. Each of these festivals has grown since then. Wanderlust, you can tell it moves a little bit more into the athletic section because you have running, hiking, surfing, all different kinds of kind of adventure sport aspects. But then number 2 is yoga as a entree of something to kind of hold it together. And of course, if you combine acro and slackline yoga with what I termed yoga, then it would be the most common thing offered to do. That's a wahoo. Lightning in a Bottle, you can tell, is definitely more of a party. Live music events dominate the festival scene. But still, yoga is number 2 of things to do, things offered at the festival. Burning Man is a little more of an outlier in that, you know, obviously dominated by party events, then all the way down at number 9, if you're looking at the top 10 things to do, would be yoga. But what's interesting here is that this number only counts yoga classes that were listed in the What, When, Where book that everyone's given when you come into GATE. That does not count all of the different camps that are explicitly all about yoga, and that's all they're doing throughout the week. So I had no idea how to tabulate that number, but if you did that, then that would greatly increase the number of yoga classes offered. So I felt like yoga was a good opportunity to make an entree. And I also felt as though, I'll give you a quote from Bija Rivers, who's one of the yoga teachers listed here. She says, "A festival class is not the city yoga class. The boundaries are expanded so people are more open, and people are more open to the interior aspects." And she goes on to explain Bhakti. I gave all the yoga teachers pseudonyms in this book. And so then I was kind of frustrated. I hadn't intended to do that. But once I did, then I was a bit frustrated that I was like, well, I've flown all around the world for 10 years trying to interview the most famous yoga teachers. And it's been very difficult. How do I express that these are not just the people down at my local studio, that I could have sat there in one afternoon and interviewed them all. And so I decided to put their Instagram numbers up so you can see the range of kind of influence or status that they have. I showed this to my 21-year-old son, and he was like, well, those aren't any more than, D-list rappers. So it depends on what your consideration of fame is. And during the pandemic, my daughter has gotten 100,000 followers on TikTok. She's 12. So obviously, it doesn't mean everything, but it does mean something. I think that these people who have a platform and they are kind of movers and shakers, some of the most famous people in the yoga world, certainly in the United States. So as these teachers are working in their classes, they're weaving in philosophical ideas, and they're crafting emotive experiences that bring their students into a space where they're receptive and they're willing and they are motivated. As Helena Blake, who's a famous yoga teacher in this field, explained, what an incredible opportunity to be able to activate all this energy. We create this environment where people are happy and healthy and inspired and excited and motivated, and you get them to this super ecstatic place, and they're all looking to make a difference. And at that moment, they'll do anything. So I don't think this is mere hyperbole. She's talking about the opportunity to help her students move into spaces of activism. But I think that the raw vulnerability and the space that your average yogi comes into, where they're very malleable and persuadable, is important in these spaces, because that really then makes what we fill them with in these spaces all the more important. So these festivals are tactile, emotional, and affective fields. They're imagined as kind of mini utopias, at least not for a longer period of time. And utopia is in contradistinction to the existing topia or even dystopia that people believe or find themselves to be in the daily. I love this picture. This is Mark Whitwell teaching. With his permission, I've used this photograph and this gentleman's tattoo, kind of speaking of the dystopic space in which he is currently enmeshed. So what is the utopia formulated with? I'll give you a quote from Eli Gordon. Hold on. He says, Albert Einstein said very beautifully that the ancient people seem to have understood something very important that we have lost. And the answer is, of course, not to go back to the way things were thousands of years ago, because that would deny all of what's happened since. This evolutionary wave is coming together, which is so beautifully evident here in the desert. All these practices and different tribal members and colors of the rainbow creating a new way. There are certain principles which are so important, and of course, nothing is more important than the Mother Earth. So in these few sentences, how he opened his kind of, this was a a 2-day yoga intensive before the festival began. He blends together this admiration for science, but also the mourning of a loss of pre-modern knowledge, a demand for a new evolution, an affirmation of creating a bricolage of practices and people for spiritual innovation, a celebration of the unification of tribes, and a demand for the centrality of ecology. These are the ideals, and yoga is the method. So as he invited yoga practitioners to create a new way and to participate in an evolutionary wave, but his vision of all different tribal members and colors of the rainbow coming together didn't really match the demographic reality of the predominantly white female participants, though they may use the language of tribe and the claim that, quote, we are all indigenous to unify their communities. So in his research on white viscosity, or quote unquote, the stickiness of whiteness in countercultural spaces, Arun Saldanha writes, it's a commonplace assumption that whites have for a long time been fascinated and transformed by drawing on other people's cultures and landscapes. Yet the fact that white appropriations of otherness were fueled by conscious effort to transcend the constraints of white society, that European exoticism and primitivism, though intertwined with colonial subjugation, also tell of the self-critique of whites and the self-transformation of whites, has seldom been at the center of theorization. So what my work attempts to do in this book is to put that precise notion at the center, to engage in the uncomfortable juxtaposition between violent and problematic white appropriations and religious exoticism, but also productive self-critique and self-transformation. I argue that these populations identify with alterity to forge personal solutions to the struggles of modernity. And in so doing, in some part, they reject the systems of white supremacy in which they are enmeshed, but they do so from within the safe spaces of white ethnic homogeneity. In festivals, they speak in self-affirming echo chambers imagined as evolutionary paths to enlightenment, and rarely engage with ethnically diverse populations. And interestingly, my research also found that the more yogic the field, and even more so, the more it relied on religious aspects of yoga, the wider the field was. I wonder if I have I think I skipped it. Okay, so I'm gonna go back. I hate to do that too. I'm sorry, don't get dizzy. But this is the demographics of the festivals. So you can see Burning Man here is coming in around 77% white, which is somewhat average for the national average, but not when you consider that it's in Nevada or that many participants come from California, which are both about half as white as Burning Man is. Then Lightning in a Bottle is even whiter, Wanderlust even more so, and then Bhakti and Shakti Fest even more so, coming in around 95% white. And of course, that means that not only are these festivals attracting a white demographic, but they are attracting a solely white demographic from the diversity of the state of California. So, and I put New York in there as well, because that's where Wanderlust headquarters is. Wanderlust is much harder to gauge because it's a global event that happens in lots of different cities. So the question then became, where was the whites only sign? Why is it there? Why are these particular people attracted to these spaces, and what kind of work is that doing for them? And I came to the primary conclusion that there's something very important about the self-critique and the other as a solution coming through religious exoticism. So let me put a kind of basic image up, and then we'll talk about that. So I found that it was also not every religion that was represented, and not every religious culture that was brought to the fore, but mostly there was a focus on what I called Indic religions, which is a broad term that I mostly mean religions that initiated in India. So that could mean, of course, Pan-Asian by now. But then also indigenous religiosities were very much present, and oftentimes they were interwoven together. So you can see there are three examples of that here. So a native drum in front of a statue, I believe that's Vishnu, and then looks like I think it's a Hardi Ram, or no, it's a Shiva scarf, and then a talking stick, and then a teepee in which they were doing chakra healing inside of it. So this confluence that I found was reproduced not only in these spaces, but then as I kind of looked back into my own life, I recognized that it was also reproduced in New Age bookstores when I was growing up in the 1990s, where I found translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead alongside Be Here Now by Ram Dass, right next to the Tao Te Ching, right next to Native American smudge sticks and pagan ritual manuals. And I found that this amalgamation was congealed in the religious explorations of the transcendentalists in the 1840s, renewed at the turn of the 20th century, revived in the counterculture of the 1960s. Don't forget the Human Bee Inn in San Francisco was a gathering of the tribes. That was how it was built. And then of course, in the New Age bookstores when I grew up, and now in these transformational festivals today. I also locate white interest in the adoption of these cultural tools as a form of self-critique of Western modernity, a distancing from and a rejection of the mainstream, but one that's not fully distanced, and one, in fact, that is dependent on what Indigenous Australian scholar Eileen Morton Robinson calls white possessivism. The simple notion that whites are raised to believe that they have unlimited access to possess all things. And I apply this to these fields of representation and show how whites not only explore and learn about and share in cultural religious forms of racialized others, but then they go one step farther to embody, possess, extract, and redistribute that alterity as a form of social capital. Their access to alterity deemed exotic marks them with distinction in white society, and it also defines them as members of a tribe defined by an affinity for religious exoticism, comprised of spiritual seekers who have chosen to identify with radical others as a form of critique of their own society, their own culture, and their own ancestral heritage. In Deepak Sharma's words, they imagine that they can, quote, transform from the oppressor to the oppressed, from the colonizer to the colonized. Surely such an imagined transformation is only available to those who are privileged in the first place. However, as opposed to Sharma's somewhat bleak view that white adoptions are either engaging in what he calls mimicry or mockery, I found that religious exoticism can be an initial step in a gradual process of self-transformation, emerging from engagement with radically different cultures, customs, philosophies, life ways, worldviews. In my view, the trouble lies not in the exploration, but in the representation, in the white possessivist logics that further economic exploitation and the cultural erasure of people of color who are then barred from performing and representing their own heritage. Importantly, also, I think that one of the features of religious exoticism is that it dissociates from real actors in favor of romanticized imagery, creating indices more malleable and controllable than their flesh and blood reference. So White Utopias examines these forms of appropriation and dissociation and shows how they result in discordant transformational worlds that incorporate both the violence of cultural appropriation and the wonders of self-transformation. And in the yogic field, I would suggest that the shorthand would be the commonplace practice of building relationships with South Asian yogic things, but not South Asian yogic people. So in chapter 2, I go into detailed discursive analysis about how this occurs among yoga teachers and practitioners, and analyze the particular anxieties about authenticity that are reiterated in yoga classes often. And I think that that anxiety has everything to do with these participants' recognition that they are speaking as representative actors for a tradition that is quite deep and outside of their native cultural context. And I think I have a few other slides. So I'll just go quickly and then I'm going to make a few case study points. So chapter 3 is on asceticism. Actually thinking about some of the things that are cultivating ascetical types of practices in these festival environments. Mysticism, the ways in which people are experiencing what we might call peak experiences or wonder and awe in these environments. But in what follows now, with the time I have left, I want to give you some case studies about how even these extraordinary experiences can be quite fraught as they are related to the politics of religious exoticism. All right. I'm just going to flip through. This is from, I should have had this slide up. Sorry, I was a little bit behind, but this is in the yoga chapter when I'm talking about two different forms of kind of knowledge that are produced in yogic spaces. I relate one to local knowledge of a kind of romanticized vision of India as a locus of knowledge and the guru as an important transmitter of that knowledge. And then the other of universal knowledge that kind of is the more spiritual but not religious version, which says knowledge is for everyone. Everyone can experience. Yoga is free and it's India's gift to the world and it belongs to everyone. And so we have no kind of need to locate that in India anymore. And my friend sent me that great sign from a yoga studio in Venice, right? No, Sanskrit is actually like a promotional thing for I believe that's a core power yoga studio. Okay, so case study 1 for time. I hope you don't mind that I kind of rush through a little bit. So in the book, I give a lengthy ethnographic vignette to Sundari Lakshmi. Obviously, that's not Sundari Lakshmi. That's another guy doing the same ritual that I'm going to describe right now. But she was a woman who conducted the opening Kali fire ceremony at Shakti Fest in 2014. Sundari Lakshmi was a soft-spoken Caucasian woman, probably about 45 years old, dressed in a black sari. And she led the puja ritual geared toward novices, reading shlokas in Sanskrit, and then an English translation from a thick binder as she poured ritual elements into the sacrificial fire. She had an assistant who was also dressed in formal Indian attire, salwar kameez, piles, bangles, a long blonde braid, and then 3 others, all white, 2 women and a man similarly dressed in Indic attire, all relatively young, whom she was training in the practice. Approximately 50 people attended the puja, which was somewhat traditional with mantras to Kali, the recitation of the 100 names, an offering of fire, sandalwood flowers, ghee, and water. Sundari Lakshmi ritually bathed both the self and the goddess in metaphor as she poured offerings into the sacrificial fire. The structure was somewhat Tantra reminiscent in that practitioners were asked to ritually transform themselves into Kali. Then we were instructed to find partners and instructed step-by-step, body part by body part, in an intimate ritual blessing of our partner's body as a living embodiment of Kali. At one point, Sundari Lakshmi exhorted, "Get intimate, you need it. Sometimes we do this puja sitting in each other's laps." And at this, everyone laughed. Afterwards, we were instructed to close out our experience with each other and return our attention to the fire while Sundari Lakshmi concluded the puja with a communal meditation and mantras. White yogis and spiritual seekers comprised the majority of participants who followed Sundari Lakshmi's instructions to perform the ritual. She claims to be an initiated yogini pujari, or a priest, lineage holder, and authorized teacher who has lived and practiced her sadhana, or spiritual practice, with adepts in Nepal, India, and Tibet. Her practice focuses on the embodiment of divine feminine and Shakta tantric lineages. She's serious about her study and her religious practice. According to her website, she's highly educated and has complemented her academic study with decades of practitioner-generated knowledge and numerous traditional tantrics, quote unquote, empowerments and transmissions. You can find her widely at yoga festivals yoga studios and on the internet offering her services as a pujari, as a teacher, and online courses. So I'm not in doubt that Sundari Lakshmi is in fact serious about her practice, but the ubiquity of white voices, even serious ones, can still create a crisis of representation where people of color are occluded and erased. In this vein, Rupa Singh, an Indian American woman and a founding member of the South Asian American People's Yoga Alliance, or SAPYA, addressed a room full of white yoga teachers tearfully with the following sentiment, quote, "As you fill that space," that is a space of representing yoga, "teach in that space, know that there is someone who looks very much like my mother and my father who is not there, who does not feel confident to integrate, to be public in this country. Just know that you are taking a space that is precious." So Singh speaks to the manner in which white bodies freely travel in public universal spaces while brown bodies are relegated to the private and the local. Therefore, cultural appropriation is in actuality a question of representation. It's not the root problem, but rather an effect of systemic racial injustice. All right, case study 2. In Kirtan and Yoga, South Asian cultural erasure has become so complete that one commentator on Facebook wrote, "When I was in India one year, a white Kirtan couple came to perform for our group, and he said, 'I'm going to sing Kirtan invented by Krishna Das.'" Now, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Krishna Das, he's a Kirtan vocalist who was born Jeffrey Cagle in Long Island. He's a serious bhakta who's been singing Kirtan for decades, who was nominated for a 2013 Grammy Award. He performs at Bhakti and Shakti Fests regularly, but despite his many accolades, he did not invent Kirtan, which can, of course, be traced back to the medieval Bhakti tradition, if not considerably farther back in Indic history. Similarly, Marissa, an unexperienced new yoga teacher, told me that in her teacher training, she read a Hindu text, something about a fajita, she told me as she laughed at her failure to recall the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. It's increasingly modifications of yoga practice in the West that have led Indian grandmothers and yogis alike to claim that is not yoga, that is only exercise. So I want to mention that Marissa was probably the most inexperienced yoga teacher that I met for 10 years. That doesn't excuse that at all, but I just wanted to note. And note also that thinking with Svetlana Todorov, who talks about exoticism in his own work, he says, quote, "Knowledge is incompatible with exoticism. Its constitutive paradox is praise without knowledge." So I think one of the ways to combat religious exoticism is to actually gain some knowledge. And that's one of my kind of suggestions for this field. Okay, 3, hubris. So when I asked Omkara, Jeffrey Goldman, who's one of the leaders in Bhakti and Shakti Fest, about whether the festivals were trying to include Indian Hindus, he explained, "There's a half a dozen motels around here that are owned by the Indians, and we support them 2 times a year. We fill them up in 1 second. We put them on our website. Super 8, Travel Lodge, High Desert. In 10 minutes, they're booked up. And they love us for that. And we let them come. So the first year we did it, 2009, they said, 'What do you,' meaning white bhaktas, 'know about Kirtan and yoga?' And we countered, 'You,' meaning Indians, 'don't know anything about Kirtan and yoga. Saraswati becomes Sarah, Krishna becomes Ken. They don't even use their own names. We're more spiritual than they are. When I go to India or I speak about India, and I've been going there since 1980 every year, I live there 2 or 3 months a year. I'm leaving to go there in a couple weeks. They speak to me about different parts of India, and I can tell them exactly where to go, what to say, how to act, like that.'" So sometimes I hear a similar rhetoric among academics and even among yogis as they lament that Indians vie for representation of their own heritage, but are not knowledgeable enough to do so. Such a claim not only denies the possibility of South Asian cultural expertise, but also enacts a paternalistic and colonialist stewardship argument in its suggestion that whites are better suited to govern and represent because of the assumed intellectual inadequacies of racialized others. Because Indians in the United States, quote unquote, don't even use their own names, we, whites, can tell them exactly where to go, what to say, and how to act. In the diasporic context, such a claim is also wildly blind to US history, wherein racist policies and practices demanded assimilation that intentionally severed knowledge transmission across generations. Furthermore, post 1965 US immigration policies targeting skilled professionals resulted in more Indian American doctors and engineers migrating to the US than yogis, philosophers, and religious studies scholars. So it's true that some Indian Americans who demand to represent their own cultural and religious heritage may not be experts in cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions. But that does not mean that inherited knowledge does not exist globally, nor does it justify the erasure of self-representation. What hubris to stand on the legacies of colonialism and racism and assert that because a people has been severed from their heritage, that the subsequent void justifies white projects to revive, dominate, and steward its legacy. We might think in terms instead of a restorative justice model that would instead seek to reconstruct those connections where they've been severed and to highlight the voices of the significant population of existing scholars and knowledge bearers. So I think I've got maybe just a few more minutes and I want to conclude in a timely way, but to say that utopias are envisioned in contradistinction to the perception of existing reality. Karl Mannheim explains that for this reason, we must recognize that utopias operate in a dialectical relationship with the current order of things. And so they fulfill the unrealized existence of the utopia. So then we might ask ourselves, what is it that these festivals are attempting to fix? What is the reality for relatively upper middle class or petit bourgeois, urban, mostly highly educated whites who are looking for something else out in the desert or in the forest? There's no real easy answer here, but if we listen to participants and how they articulate the festival, then taking the inverse of that might lead to some suggestions as to the substance of the existing reality to which the festival is a solution. So to begin, most fundamentally, participants described the festivals as safe and protected spaces where they felt at home. This feeling of being at home with a supportive community directly relates to subsequent feelings of openness, connection with others, joy, and freedom. So then we might imagine that the inverse of this would be an unsafe and precarious space where no one feels at home or one feels not at home. In other words, displaced, a society in which one feels isolated, disconnected from others, confined, and as a result, unhappy. And this is something that, you know, a lot of anthropologists have already been talking about. Anna Singh's recent work on precarity, the ways in which globalization has kind of unsettled and capitalism and under neoliberal capitalism has rendered existence to be more precarious for large groups of humanity, even for the wealthy. And I think what's interesting then is to think about if these are the winners of those systems that are in place, and even they are unhappy, then what does that say about people who are less successful under these systems as well? I also had a kind of sinking feeling as I heard so many people talk about the joy of safety and coming home to these festival environments. And I began to wonder if the home and the feeling of safety and security had to do with their ethnic homogeneity. And I relied in the conclusion on Robert Putnam's work about how diversity brings out the turtle in all of us, he says, kind of makes people want to recluse and not engage. Whereas in more homogenous spaces, people come together, feel more free, feel more open. And I think that is definitely at play in these festival spaces. But I also argue that I think there's an ideological commons that transcends ethnicity, that is also built in these spaces and makes people feel as though they're coming home to a space of sanctity, security, and freedom among like-minded others. So I want to give the last word to Nico. And, just when I thought all was lost, I was at the favela bar at Lightning in a Bottle. And the irony is so great because, of course, a favela bar and the favelas are being highly gentrified in Brazil. And then I crawled into a covered wagon for some shade. So all the settler colonial imagery there. But there was an African-American DJ in there, and I struck up a conversation. I said, hey, what do you think about this space? And when I asked him, I expected him to condemn this space of cultural appropriation. And instead, he said, there's a lot of people, white people who are exploring other cultures and wearing African headdresses and doing yoga and having these mystical experiences. And then he said, I think white people are on a journey of evolution, like embracing these other cultures and like getting to the point where they're more aware of what's going on, and they are. He said, but it's a journey because however many years ago, it was a totally different climate, and you have to realize that it takes time for that. It's not going to happen overnight. So I'll leave you with his optimism. And while you may not feel it, I think it's worth discussing and to think through those critiques that are at the heart of these kind of explorations. And that's what I'll stop you with. Thank you. I hope I stayed to time. I'm not sure. I hope so.
Thank you so much. Please, if you have questions, this is a great time to begin our conversation.
Should we close down the slides?
Yeah, sure. That's better so that we can have a face-to-face conversation.
I think Sarah has a question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm reading the chat as well.
Hey. Hi, thank you so much for may I go? I don't know if, I'm not sure if I'm following protocol, but Mahir just called on me, so I thought I would jump in. So thank you, Amanda, for your lovely talk. I have your book right here. I actually ordered it almost upon publication. I'm a professor in the history department at Cal State Long Beach. I'm also a 500-hour RYT, and I've been to very many Bhakti and Shakti fests and Lightning in a Bottle, and some more obscure yoga festivals that certainly share the cultural appropriations that you're talking about, and actually some more deviant ways, actually, and that's maybe for another conversation. But I have a couple of questions for you to maybe trouble some of the parameters of your argument. And it's, it's Wednesday evening, why not? One of them is the issue around whiteness and how you're defining that. And you're defining it, it seems, at least in the talk, and I think also in the book, as really flat. It's a very flat definition. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about yoga culture in the United States, and certainly after 20 years of practicing, is that it's also, very Jewish, right? There's this Jewish fascination with yoga, and a lot of the kirtan practitioners, the Jayutals, for example, are Jews. And I have friends who are Jewish from the East Coast who are professional musicians who play in those bands. And so the merging of cultures that happens at these festivals, I will certainly agree with you, there's cultural appropriation going on. But I've also talked to Indian participants at them, and many of them are purveyors of products, selling gods and goddesses and fetishes at the festivals, who call me a Hindu or a Buju for my participation. And it's meant very affectionately, and I take it as such. But it's not, but we're talking about something that's kind of well beyond whiteness, and there's a cultural exchange, and it's old. And it goes back, we can go back to Allen Ginsberg, we can go back further. So in some ways that's running through this. Now I take your point that the festival environment is generating a different type of energy, but the notion that it's a flat whiteness, which when I hear people say that, I interpret as WASP. And that's not actually what's happening at Bhakti and Shakti Fest in Southern California. It is more ethnically complicated than a flat white latte. And so that's worth, I think, interrogating. The other thing too, there are certainly people going to these festivals for self-realization and for yoga practice, but everyone who's a serious yogi who attends knows you're not going to get serious yoga at these festivals. That's not why you go. They're like Grateful Dead shows for yogis. Like, they're fun. You go, you're going to run into people you didn't see since the last festival. There's sex and there's drugs. People have a good time. There's camping. It's this kind of other type of energy that's replaced the music festivals of the previous 20 years. And so that's all happening too. So I take your point 100%, and you're not wrong about a general sort of demographic and but if you push at those phenotypes at all, it gets a little more complicated. And I just wondered if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your comment. I appreciate it. Let me start with the second point first. I think that the yoga in these spaces is variant depending on the festival. And so the festivals in the book are very different from each other. And that's really important to highlight and to note. I think that, for example, I found in Wanderlust festivals, the yoga was actually quite serious, and there were a lot of yoga teachers. Most of the classes, in fact, that I did at Wanderlust were filled with yoga teachers who were vigorously taking notes and using the hours as part of their teacher training, and very much actively seeking out expertise from very famous yoga teachers who were very serious about their practice there. So I guess I would be cautious of saying that the yoga is not serious and that the festivals are like a Grateful Dead concert, right? I think for some people, for sure, absolutely. And then for others, maybe less so. On the whiteness, I take Kimberly's point in the chat, and I think that's a good thing to start to be clear about, right? In that we're not talking about various ethnic groups and how people necessarily, different festivals is different. So at Burning Man, there is a census that they do where I'm pulling the demographic data from. So then we actually do know that people would self-identify as white. And that's the data that I'm thinking through with them. Other festivals, I was looking at everything that could be regarded as white pigment privilege, right? It's mostly a visual reference. So that means you could have all different kinds of people who are within that category. And it is very diverse within the category of whiteness, but everyone there appeared as white. And I think thinking through anti-Black racism in the US right now, there's a lot of people who would say, and I would agree with them, that if you have that kind of pigment privilege, then you have to kind of locate yourself within at least that privilege, if not the category of whiteness. So I'm sure some people would not identify in that way, but they still operate according to the privilege of the pigmentation of their skin. On that note, though, if you're interested in the Jewish connection, I just wrote an article with Michael Alexander, which hopefully will come out this month or two, in a book about LA and religion, which does talk about the really strong connections between Judaism and yoga and kirtan in particular. And I think it's a really cool article thinking about hybridity and the ways in which Jewish identity does problematize spaces of, I mean, the question of whiteness around Judaism has been hundreds of years old. So that is definitely a thread that we can take. I think that's not the case for all the festivals, but most certainly for Bhakti and Shakti Fest, there's a huge overlap between LA Jewish community and the yoga and kirtan community there. I think that comes from the kind of some of the leaders in that festival, and that's their network and their connections, but then also famous kirtan artists, everyone from, as you mentioned, Jai Uttal to Krishna Das to Sean Korn to Saul David Ray, right? All kinds of people who are leading that community and would identify as both Jewish, but largely probably on a census also white. So I appreciate your comment. Thank you very much. Is it Jira? I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I'm doing it.
Hi, my name is Jaira.
Oh, Sarah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. I hope this doesn't get me banned from future events, but I just thought it was really interesting because I kind of came into this space expecting to kind of learn about the history of like colonialism and how it's affected, you know, people of color. But not saying that this research isn't important, but I think that I was expecting to kind of learn more about that. But then the conversation was kind of centered around like how white people operate in these spaces. And I think that it's important to note too that like, while it did seem like there was a positive ending at the end of the presentation, like, you know, personally seeing also the past week of like the anti-Asian violence, like I already didn't feel good about anything happening in terms of like race in America. And that just like, you know, I've had multiple conversations with, you know, white people in my life about like these issues. And I think actually, very ironically, I invited one of my friends who is, who we had a conversation about, you know, is it appropriate to like include like references from other people's cultures in your poetry? And she had made like a blanket statement during class, and I was just really confused by that. I was like, wouldn't it be more useful to just like send people to like a person of color's writing instead? And I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but I guess it does concern me like that I don't see these types of like spaces, safe spaces for white people as a safe space for anyone. Because when I see that type of like cultural appropriation, I think of like how it's just really sad that like in order to come to the US, my parents had to assimilate and I had to lose my own culture. And so for some people, it's like a hobby or like an interest for them to go out of their way to like kind of seek that adventure and diversity. But it's a lot more than that. And so I think that I was kind of hoping to learn more about that. But and I think that this research is necessary, right? Because, you know, if we don't study these spaces, like what is being transferred here or exchanged can be lost. But I don't think we should think of it as an exchange. As was said earlier, it really is appropriation, and it really is a harmful thing when we're in the United States in the context of American imperialism, because we cannot ignore that history and that past and what harm it has caused onto people of color. And so I don't think of it as a compliment when white people are trying to like, I guess, learn more about my culture, but do so without centering people of color at the center, because at the end of the day, what you get is a caricature or a flattening of someone. And then it becomes that much more easier to scapegoat a certain population. It becomes that much easier to enact violence against people that we don't see as nuanced or and you know, I think that there's also inherently an issue with white people going into other countries on, you know, a fun trip to learn, when in reality, a lot of these poor people in those countries do not have the same privilege of leaving their situations to go and have fun abroad and to go and have fun and have important cultural exchanges. We have to think about these things from the context of privilege. And I appreciate having this conversation, but I also am extremely, extremely tired and exhausted of having told to me what my experience of colonialism and what racism is by white individuals. And this is no shaming on anyone in particular, but it has been my experience that, I will try to speak up about these things and will continually get told or minimized in those spaces. And so I am a little bit disappointed. I was really hoping that we would talk about, from the perspective of like people of color and how, how yoga is appropriated into the wellness industry and into capitalism and things like that. But, I mean, it is a little bit disappointing, but I'm not here to like bash anyone. I just wanted to express that because I am a little bit sad. And I think that from what I've seen is that a lot of like white folks tend to have a more optimistic view about like, you know, race relations in the United States. And it has not, I've woken up with a pit in my stomach every single day for the past few months. And I don't feel good about it at all. And then the shooting was like the most catastrophic confirmation of everything that I had been feeling about how Asian women are sexualized and then viewed as to be disposable, especially women who are in more vulnerable situations, those who are sex workers, those who are masseuses, and all of these things. So sorry, I didn't expect to be so emotional, but that's kind of like the standpoint of kind of how I feel at this moment. And yeah, so thank you.
Jira, I think it's really important that you spoke. I just want to, everyone, please give her a round of applause. Like, I mean, that's hard to do. And I'm really glad that you did. And I should have started off, I had a few things to say and then I didn't start off thinking about the events of this week. And there, you really cannot, I think you're absolutely right. And that we can't ever decontextualize this from the context of American imperialism, as you said, white supremacy, gun violence, racialized gun violence, white hetero-Christian, hetero-patriarchy, etc. And that these are not, I find that a lot of people, the people on the other side who read this book say, well, what's the big deal, right? That's like, who cares? Like, who cares what the silly hippies do in the desert? Or who cares, let them do yoga. What's wrong with doing yoga? But I think that there is a way in which these performances, which occur within largely white spaces, justify violence in exactly the way that you alluded to, through dehumanization, by creating caricatures. I think you said it perfectly well. I almost don't even want to reiterate what you've said. So I just want to acknowledge your experience. And I think that you're absolutely right. And I think also, sometimes when I'm giving talks, I feel the need to kind of like end on a happy note because I feel sad to present. That's just me being human and honest with y'all, even though I'm being recorded and broadcast on YouTube. The book is deeply ambivalent. And if you've read the book, you'll find no matter what side of the coin you're on, I think you'll probably walk away a bit dissatisfied. There is no happy ending in the book, I wouldn't say, as I tried to kind of give in the talk. And I think I think we have to really consider the consequences. And I think a lot of these festivals are considering the consequences for what these spaces are producing. And it expands far beyond the festival being a white space of white domination to our academic departments, to discourses, to journals, academic journals, to yoga studios, to, you know, broad spaces in our world that we are still actively sometimes working to decolonize, but then also sometimes not even realizing that they need to be decolonized if we're coming from a position of power and privilege. So I encourage all of us and myself included to listen as much as we're speaking right now. I was very concerned to even put this book out this year. I almost stopped, but then, you know, tenure and etc. Kimberly, do you want to field for me since we've got a few different hands up?
Sure, or I'll let Mihir. I think he's already unmuted. Go ahead, Mihir.
I'm sorry, I don't, Kim, I think, why don't you do it?
Sure. Uncle, Mr. Pandya.
Yes, hi. I just had one question. I'm sort of intrigued. Why do you call yoga pre-modern? Of course, it is very ancient tradition, but it's very much prevalent, as you obviously know. And I think similarly, many practices such as Tai Chi, for example, thousands of people outside in the open in China practice every day. So these are traditions which are very much part of our current lives.
Of course, of course. If you're talking, it took me a minute to think about what you were referencing, but you're referencing the title, which is positioning the pre-modern, right? Or
yes,
something like that.
yes,
Romanticizing the pre-modern.
exactly.
That's coming from my field. That's not my language. I should probably put it in quotation marks or scare quotes, meaning that I feel as though the participants in these fields are looking for a solution to the crisis of modernity by looking to other cultures that they view to be pre-modern. That's the exoticization of those other cultures. It's not, of course, that we don't have contemporary indigenous people, contemporary Indian people, contemporary Buddhists and Hindus and yogis today, which are very much active in the world, but that the ways in which these informants are looking to solve the crisis of modernity is by looking to the pre-modern, which they identify with non-white cultures.
So I'm sorry, just who calls it pre-modern? Do these people who are practicing it call it pre-modern, or the researchers such as yourselves call it pre-modern?
It's oftentimes, if we're speaking about yoga in particular, it's positioned as an ancient practice, 5,000 years old. That's usually what is a local example coming from these field sites. So that's what I mean by pre-modern.
But don't you think it's in some ways a problematic?
No, of course it's problematic. That's the point of the talk, in some sense, that is the exoticization of the other. That's precisely what the talk is about.
Don Robinson?
Yes, you mentioned Robert Putnam during your lecture. Years ago, I used to do a lot of bowling. And Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which is a wonderful book to read. And what his theory is, he laments the loss of community activity in American culture. No book clubs, no bowling clubs, no bridge clubs, things like that. People tend to cocoon more in their homes, watch TV, and so on. The subtitle of his book, Bowling Alone, is The Collapse and Revival of American Community. And I'm just wondering whether you could look at these transformational festivals as a way of reviving American community, bringing people together for a common purpose, as opposed to having kind of separate activities in which they don't interact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's their intention behind the producers and behind the people who are coming together. That's absolutely their intention, is to build community. There's, I would say, 3 words that are used, maybe 4. I'll say 4 words, or even the titles of the chapters, but freedom, authenticity, and then community, absolutely, is one of the cornerstones of what people believe that they're doing in these festival spaces.
Thank you.
Tim?
Unmuting. I'm looking forward to a day when I'm not muting and unmuting. We're going to be physically together again and telling each other to mute. I wanted to ask you a question about the global, you know, at the very end, right, you made this kind of connection about globalization, reaction to globalization. You know, I was thinking the extent to which this becomes sort of globalized or even colonial, right? In the sense that is this a uniquely white American thing, or is it? I mean, do we have a similar New Ageism, you know, in Western Europe? And thinking about India, I mean, you know, the appeal of New Age music in India. My friends in India, many of them go to what I would call sort of Western yoga studios, and they, you know, this type of thing. Is it sort of transportable out of this American context?
Yeah, and I think in the book is more global than maybe I let on today, but I went to festivals in New Zealand and in Canada and in Australia. There's a circuit of transformational festivals, which hits everywhere from, you know, Bali is a major site, Thailand, parts of India, but not all of India. So yes, it is global. And I do think that even in those spaces, whiteness has a power that is also globalized and also interacts with locals in distinctive ways. What was the other thing though? You said something else that was interesting about, not just about whiteness, but about tourism.
Yeah, but it's another kind of form of cultural colonialism, if you like, or.
I had something interesting to say to that. I do think that it is oftentimes a relatable circuit. You know, Arun Saldana's work is in Goa, which is, I think, some of these EDM party sites and also yoga sites have a culture that moves throughout the globe and the yoga teachers also go on this similar circuit with retreats in Costa Rica and then in Bali and then the coast of Greece and then LA or California, British Columbia. Oh, I guess that was the other thing I was going to say. Is I think it's interesting, and some Wanderlust is moving out of this a little bit, but there is a settler colonial state that does have a resonance here. And then I think between that, like a lot of Israelis at Burning Man, a lot of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, right? All of the countries that I just listed so that's all there. And then of course, you know, tourism, chapter 3 is a bit on tourism, and tourism in Asia for enlightenment has of course a long Orientalist and colonial history as well.
So rapid fire 2 questions. Mihir was asking an interesting question in the chat about the relationship or the contrast comparison of the studio with the festival, which I think is a fascinating question. And then I have a question about you center, obviously the book centers whiteness. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on age and life stage, because in some of the images that you showed us, there not only were the practitioners homogeneously white, they were homogeneously young adults as well. So how does that relate particularly to transformation, the possibility for transformation and for seeking? There were other images where that was not true, but I'm interested to hear like what role life stage maybe played.
Mm-hmm. I didn't do a lot. I mean, I can only say anecdotally what I know about yoga studios from going to them myself. And what I heard in festival spaces was that a lot of yoga teachers felt very much more free in the festival spaces, teaching and learning in those spaces, because they didn't feel confined by the rules and regulations that were imparted by studio owners. I also interviewed a lot of yoga teachers who had given up their leases, and I think there's a financial aspect of what's happening to yoga studios even before the pandemic as well, that they found that they could brand on Instagram and make money without keeping the overhead. Certainly in Southern California or Northern California, it's a heavy price to have your own studio to try to maintain that. I feel like a lot of yoga teachers were very frustrated with the studio environment, and that once they ended up doing management all the time, they lost their own practice, or they ended up just kind of like managing their staff of yogis who were maybe getting along or maybe not getting along, or managing, you know, broken front windows or whatever they had to do with the studio space and the kind of taxing and heavy financial load of keeping a studio.
I guess my question was also partly about what work does the festival itself do? In part because, as I mentioned in the chat, there's this article that I like by Fred Turner about Burning Man, and how Burning Man serves as this kind of site of production for tech companies, for companies like Google, where they can add a kind of spiritual depth to the form of labor that they do on a daily basis. And I'm wondering if you think that the festival space itself does a certain kind of work for yoga, right? Or for these kinds of yoga events. That's a distinct, you know, I mean, you know, do you see what I'm saying? Like it as a...
Yeah, I think it does. Some more than others, but I think that it does. I think something like, I think that every festival that a yoga teacher goes to or appears with, or even brings their studio to, that happens sometimes, is a form of social capital that then they bring back that event to the studio or bring it back to their Instagram following as a space of transformation or even just experience, right? Look what we did, togetherness, that can be a form of, you know, if we want to think through it in a capitalist, spiritual capitalism way, a la like Corette and King, then that is a form of social capital that they're bringing back and then commodifying and marketing to gain a following. I think it also, though, is a extra studio, meaning like extra social, like getting out into the desert together with people who are in your yoga studio, can also be a form of bonding, of creating those relationships that then will make people have more allegiance to your studio or to your persona as a yoga practitioner. A lot of the yoga teachers are at Burning Man as well, and it's certainly that once you go to Burning Man with somebody, your chances of being friends with them and connected to them in future are much higher. I want to mention age in that I think the tendency from people looking from the outside into these spaces tends to think that they are all rich and young. And that's not necessarily the case. Certainly for some of the more high profile festivals, it's important to remember that people take pictures of beautiful people. And so there's a lot of older people who are less beautiful, for example, who do not get their pictures on Instagram or, you know, on the internet when you Google images of a festival to find out who goes there. So I think that that's an important thing. There are also a generation, I would say, of older hippies who are kind of boomer types, who are very much present in these festival spaces. And Burning Man in particular, because it's a bucket list item, you can get some pretty old folks. I met a woman with a bag of ice on the back of her neck who was like 80, and she had just always wanted to come, and she came. So those people are represented. However, I also think one more note on that. It varies by festival. So the more expensive and more difficult to get to festivals like Burning Man tends to draw in a little bit of an older crowd. I think I'm actually actually spot on Burning Man age. I think it's 40 or so, 45, that is the primary peak in their age demographic. They do a census, which is really helpful to pigeon these demographic data. A festival like Lightning in a Bottle, which is more like a kind of concert, eco-conscious learning event, also heavily drug event, is much younger. I definitely felt old at Lightning in a Bottle for sure. I'd say the average peak age, if I were to guess, again, they don't do census data, would probably be 25. So that's quite young. Bhakti Fest, I think it's blended in that you have the kind of young and sprightly 25-year-old yogi, but then you also have the 65-year-old person who has been a bhakta their whole life, and they've been running satsangs out of their living room, and they're quite well off by this point. It's quite diverse, I would say. Then again, some of these festivals, I would bring my mom, who's 70, and she always just said how young and beautiful everybody was. I could not convince her that the demographic was any older than 25 ever. But then again, the people who are young and beautiful oftentimes take up more space. You don't notice the kind of older person who's not, in front of the cameras. It's an important question, though.
Other questions? I haven't seen any others in the chat.
Can I just follow up on the age? I was wondering about if occupation and class, and the maybe this is my imagined sense of it, is that in the distance between being in that space and then back to your workspace, if you get my drift, right? To what extent does the cultural practice and the lifestyle that takes place at Burning Man or wherever, how does that translate in terms of how people represent themselves in their domestic space or whatever? I'm not being very clear about that question, but I'm also just interested in, are these relatively middle-class folks?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And maybe I see the workspace question as maybe a little different from that. So let me give you what demographic data I have. I'll tell you, when I first moved here and I was maybe 3 years into these festival spaces, I wanted to know that exact question because nobody was producing it. Burning Man does, again, but nobody else was. And I didn't know, I think at that point, Burning Man wasn't even a part of this project. So I was making my own survey. I made a survey including information about income, and in my naivete, I capped it at, I think, $250,000 a year. I had no idea what I was doing, right? Obviously, then when I looked at Burning Man census data and saw that I think their category was 500 and over was where they ended, that I didn't know the depth of wealth that was coming into these spaces. With that said, the survey that I did among yoga festivals in particular, and I think it was, Sarah, who mentioned that there's a lot of different other yoga festivals out there that I could have included, whether it's Cape Cod Yoga Festival or the Hanuman Festival in Boulder. But they tended to bifurcate into about $100,000 to $120,000 is the highest income rate, but then also under $20,000 as a high, as the largest number of people from that income bracket. And that was by individual. So you can imagine if it was a couple, potentially both of them could be making those incomes. But by individual, I would say that would make someone in California relatively middle class. I would say, what does it take to buy a house in LA? I think you have to make $100,000. And in Idaho or Kansas, maybe that's a lot of money, but around here, I would say that makes you upper middle class, maybe middle to upper middle. And then the very poor with no income is really interesting. I think those are people who are trading rides to get there, who are part of the van economy, who are working gig jobs in order to hit the next festival, who are maybe part of a wealthy or at least upper middle class legacy and background, but maybe in their 20s without steady employment right now, or they may be students or something like that. That's where I saw that. Burning Man as well, those numbers are similar. They go up a little bit. And you know that median, instead of being 100 to 120, would be like 150 or so. And then you also at Burning Man, like I said, have the uber rich, the Beyoncés and the Katy Perrys and the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world who are also there. I think about at the 3% level though, you know, it's not, they don't predominate, but they are, like I said, with the beautiful young people, they are also loud. If you see Beyonce on Playa, many people will take a picture. And so then, you know, that becomes kind of notorious for the event, even if that's not the predominant number of kind of people who are there.
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Please, yes.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. Very interesting. I am from India, and many years ago when I came to this country in the early 80s and started working, I also taught yoga on the side in the city of Cerritos and city of Downey. And it occurs to me, and I wonder what you have to say about it, but in India, yoga was always considered a very personal, individual, practice. For example, in the school where I learned yoga, each person would be doing a different asana in a quiet environment, and the teacher would go and sit with them and explain each one. It was a very personalized, very individualized kind of learning. And the practice of yoga is also highly personal. Each person does yoga, different forms of yoga in their own way for their own development. It is not, as I learned from your talk, looked upon as a social or a group or a racial or some kind of situation. And even here, when I was teaching for a while, I did for about 15 years for these cities before I retired, I found most of the people who came to the class were middle class and educated, I think. And they also, at least in my class, they were mainly interested in learning the exercises. I did not notice any social element or ethnic element or anything. And I thought it was wonderful. I have some lifelong friends. And you're right, some of them were Jews. In fact, one of my friends, Phil Goldberg, has written a book on the transformation stuff brought in from India to this country. And when you talk of things like appropriation, now I studied engineering, I studied all Western technology, I speak English. Would you consider that to be appropriation? You know, I don't know. It's kind of cross-cultural thing. We're all learning from one another, and we are all trying to be better. That's the way I see it. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Ashley. Thank you for that heart. I think it's great to hear your experience. And people take yoga for all different kinds of reasons. And I'm sure that there are some people who are in a festival space looking for yoga as a social event. I think that a lot of people who are in that same space may have a personal practice that they see to be very intimate and private, that they work on, you know, in a quiet way in their own space and in their own time, that then they go further that in variety of ways, whether it's with a studio class or with a one-on-one instruction or in a festival class. So I think that absolutely resonates with these fields. I think that if we want to think about, I guess I also remember what I was going to say to Tim. So I'll wrap this two into one and hopefully tell a story. So I was in Rishikesh, which is a city in northern India, understood to be a holy city by many. It's also the epicenter for yoga teacher trainings in the world, I believe, right now. So when I was at the Ghat, one of the more holy Ghats in Rishikesh, Ghats are the stairs leading down to the Ganga, there was a little music store blaring budgeons, and the budgeons that they were blaring from this little music store at the holiest god in one of the holiest cities in India was Deva Premal, who is a white female kirtan artist. Now, in the US, Deva Premal has often kind of flamed for this notion of cultural appropriation. And I found myself wondering, like, why is she celebrated here and not celebrated in the US for her devotion and her art? And I think that it has everything to do with the existing power relations of the space. So in India, where Hindus predominate, there's no threat necessarily issued by Deva Premal singing bhajans at the god in Rishikesh. Here in the US, where the kirtan scene and the yoga scene is so predominantly white, is obfuscating South Asian representation, whereas Jira says it's in a context of American imperialism, anti-Asian hate crimes, it's a whole different thing to have sole white representation. And that's where the violence of appropriation happens, is not, as I said, in the learning, in the you know, I'm a professor, right? I'm all about learning. We should all learn things. And learning, in fact, can be part of a solution, I think, to this idea of a flat, exotic understanding of the other. But the trouble, in my opinion, really does come from these violences of representation that change the field and have impact for people of color.
Well, considering the hour, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your, fascinating talk and your generosity in responding to all of our questions. So everyone, please join me in thanking.
Thank you all. Thanks for letting me come and speak with you. I really appreciate all your smart thoughts and careful consideration.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys very much, and we hope to see you at the Slanky lecture.
Amanda, do you mind staying on with me here and I and Kim?